So let's look at versioning with the query string. Using the query string is a pretty straightforward approach. It's simply going to allow us, when we make the call here, to include the version we're looking for. And the nice part about using something that's not part of the path of the URL is that we can determine the business rules for this. Is version 2 the default if it's not supplied, or is version 2 going to be used only if it's supplied? And we can make those decisions. In our case, we're always going to return version 1 unless someone specifically specifies what version they're looking for. So this will still work because we've hard-coded 2, but let's go ahead and read out our version here in the code. So instead of being hard-coded to 2, let's create a new method called getVersionFromQueryString. And I'm going to pass the request, because the request is going to include the information I need, most notably what is in that query string. Let me go ahead and generate a method for this. And we want to return just a string because we're going to concatenate it, so I'll fix that up. And this is a pretty simple implementation. I'll fire through it pretty quickly. We want to get the query itself, and we can do that with HTTP utility parse query string, and then from the request, look at the request URI.query. Now I like the way parse query string works because if it doesn't include it, it returns a null for the value. So we can simply say version equals query. If version does not equal null, return version. Otherwise, we can default to returning 1, right? We can decide that if it's not included, if this v parameter isn't included, go ahead and tell us what that default is going to be. So here, if we don't include the v2 and just return, it's going to find the version based on the 1 being returned, right? Because the version is going to be whatever that default value is. But if we add the v equals 2, we're going to get the second version. Again, all we're doing here in the code is writing a small piece of code that's going to determine, based on the query string, what version they want to use. And this is a pretty straightforward method for doing this. The negative here is that even when we're returning v2, our URL isn't including it, and if we click on it, it's going to take us to the old version. And so a typical way this is handled is back in that model factory. Because what we can do that may not be all that obvious is when we create 2 here, we can actually include other objects in the list of objects that we're going to use to new up this path. And if they're not part of the normal route, they get converted into query string variables. So if I say v equals 2 as another piece for it to construct the URL from, let's refresh that. We can see that it went ahead and put v2 on the end. So that when someone goes and gets the version 2 of our measures, that we're going to go ahead and determine this. And the nice thing about this approach is that we could look at the query string based on that request anywhere down the line and go ahead and determine how to produce this URL. Again, the business rules for what you want to do there are going to vary. Because if we go to just get, let's say, this individual food, unless we're going to create a second version of the foods that knows how to return that measure, we're going to want it to continue to return the same amount of data. Now, this is one of those cases where you're returning more data, you're not removing any data, so old code shouldn't break, but your contract with them about the shape of the data may include the size of that payload, and so you don't want to bulk up that payload accidentally. Let's look at another approach.